Hey guys, today's story is about a DM that's never seen a rulebook. This story takes place during the pandemic while everyone was stuck at home. Someone in my friend group had mentioned that he enjoyed D&D and asked if we would like to try to do a campaign together. None of us had played before, but we were intrigued and agreed to try it. 8 of us made our characters in D&D Beyond, and we started a week later. The first few sessions went pretty well, and we were all blissfully ignorant of how some aspects of the game would work. But eventually, we all got around to reading the source books. And that was when it dawned on us that we weren't actually playing D&D 5e. It also became apparent that the DM hadn't read any of the rules or systems. And these aren't the only problems that we encountered while playing with this DM, but I'll get more into it later. You may wonder why we continued to go along with the DM, but bear in mind that none of us knew what D&D was like beforehand. During the first few sessions, the DM had insisted on this weird, unchangeable turn order. Now, this may seem alright since initiative can be a bit finicky, especially when we're doing digital dice rolls. However, this turn order wasn't just for combat, it was for everything. Roleplay, walking around town, the DM required everything to be done in order. And our turns sort of followed combat rules. Instead of one action, one bonus action, etc., we had 2 action points, and later on 3. 1 bonus action, and unlimited reactions. Although, admittedly, this did actually make the monk a beast against archers. With movement taking one of those AP, and us not being allowed to split up movement like raw things were, things slowed down substantially and led to ridiculous situations. In one session, it took 15 to 20 minutes to walk into a shop, never mind actually doing the bartering. This system basically prevented roleplay and inter-party conversations. So after several months, our characters were all acquaintances at best. And with a mix of alignment as well, the party would either be kind to NPCs, or genocidal, depending on how the turn orders went. There was no balance in combat, and the action system made fighting incredibly tedious. This DM didn't understand what challenge rating meant, and we would run into either very basic, easy-to-kill soldiers, or high-level demon lords, or even entire armies. And on top of this, combat was frequently railroaded. If we were doing well, the DM would start fudging rolls and changing enemy HP to the point that we didn't even think he gave enemies a set HP anymore. He would also randomly bring in overpowered NPCs to either fight or scare off enemies. An example of this was one time when we put our level 4 and 5 characters against 4 enemies that probably had a CR of 15 plus each. Obviously, we barely did any damage, so the entire encounter was us pinging off attacks off the enemy's armor, while the DM had a literal god fight the enemy for us. Then there was also an issue of magic. To quote what the DM said to our Circle of the Land Druid, "I don't care about it." And he complained about spellcasters relying on spells and not engaging in melee. Whenever a player tried to use a spell more complex than Firebolt or Cure Wounds, the DM would either make it useless, or give the enemies ridiculously high modifiers to the saving throws. And when the elf druid who grew up in the Feyfields tried to use Wild Shape, the DM literally said, "You've never seen an animal!" And then the juicy stuff came with the favoritism, bullying, inconsistencies, and in-game racism. One player was basically bullied out of the game because of slow, imprecise language, due to 1. Not knowing anything about D&D, and 2. Being on the autism spectrum. For example, she tried to cast Firebolt once, and she took a second to decide where to aim, and the DM lost his patience, saying, "Well, the firebolt goes off and blows up the shed with all the loot." And on the second session, he broke her paladin because she failed to stop an evil PC from killing an incapacitated enemy. And at a different time, he had 4 ruffians rob her in the middle of a tavern. Thanks to the weird turn order system, he barred any of us from interfering to help. And when she tried to resolve it peacefully with a decent persuasion check, he just had her grappled without rolling for it, and all of her possessions were taken with no route to stop it. Along with the bullying of this one player, he constantly made snide comments and gaslit the other players by making our spells and abilities useless, and then complaining about how little we could do. The favoritism became apparent several sessions in when the DM started adding his own outside friends into the campaign, and conveniently, none of the awkward ruling applied to them. And to add on to that, they came in 3 levels above the rest of the group. His preferred players were also handed legendary items at level 4, and they all got plot hooks and character development moments. This led to wild inconsistency in rulings between players. The rogue with lower speed using the bonus action to dash would move normally, yet the monk using Step of the Wind would seemingly move less distance despite having higher base speed. And when the druid who was diseased for dubious reasons, a disease that did 10d10 necrotic damage mind you, I used Lesser Restoration on him, and that was ruled as ineffective. But when one of the DM's favorites used protection from poison, the disease auto-magically disappeared. Inconsistency was also ripe in the plot, and established world building would change from session to session, and we were constantly railroaded. Once we were 3/4 of the way through a water dungeon. Then the DM got bored and didn't know how to end the dungeon, so he teleported us to a fiery demon dungeon for another one of those unbalanced combat encounters. He also ignored the extensive character backstories he had us write, so he could make things up on the spot. For example, my cleric's deity seemed to change every session. The lore inconsistency led to a lot of in-game racism, and it was made apparent that the campaign's 2 countries were very racist towards elves and half-ones. We just so happened to have 2 half-elves and an Eladrin elf, and when we stopped in towns or cities, the racism would drag things out and create a lot of extra conflict for the Eladrin and one of the half-elves, both of whom were played by women. However, it never seemed to affect the half-elf played by a guy, who was invited into the game by the DM. The player for the Eladrin also happened to be Jewish, and her character seemed to take the brunt of the in-game abuse. And looking back on the DM's past of dubious views, it makes the elf racism seem very problematic. We were nearing the end of the last session, due to the players and the DM quitting. Overall, it was one hellish introduction to D&D, and I'm unsure how successfully I've been able to convey just how bad it was, since there were so many examples and no one's got time for that. Luckily, we now have other games lined up with different DMs, so maybe one day we can enjoy this game. Well guys, when someone is not being very subtle on the in-game racism by putting their real-world views and then just masking that as a different race, that's a bit low, but hopefully this guy never DMs again, and hopefully all the players involved, if they ever go back to D&D, find a good DM so they can actually enjoy the game. But in any case, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you would like to chat and hang out with other people, I have a Discord link in the description. But, as always, have a good one.